أهلا وسهلا بكم.
Welcome, everyone.
الساعة 9 أهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا.
So welcome, everyone, and thank you for your time and for your presence in our webinar, which we are holding for the International Day in Support for Torture Victims. Headline: The Torture Victims in Saudi Arabia Forgotten Stories Behind the Celebrations. My name is Dua Tahini. I'm the Chief Researcher at the European Saudi Human Rights Organization, and also Mr. Taha Al-Haji, Legal Director, and also Mrs. Falaha Sayed Mina, Human Rights Researcher, and also Mr. Zaki Saraf, also who is a Chief Researcher at Reprieve. Our webinar will be in both English and Arabic language. You can choose whatever language you would like to hear the webinar at. So the modern world is trying to put a legal and practical framework for the human rights in which the states are subjecting commitments, including the Convention Against Torture and other inhumanitarian treatments. In 1997, Saudi Arabia has ratified this convention, and thus it should sanction all torture in law and in practice. Unfortunately, and despite 26 years have passed for this ratification, Saudi Arabia is still practicing torture widely. Saudi Arabia has restricted the civil community to a great extent, in which it's impossible to have a true human rights activism for human rights. This was in parallel with also restricting all kinds of actions for the community and terrorizing the families and the victims, in which Saudi Arabia criminalizes any communication with NGOs outside and also with media, and also sanctions any kind of content. So the reality right now is very difficult. It's very difficult to reach the cases of those tortured in the prisons. And all those who actually practice this torture are protected by law. And Saudi Arabia is trying to whitewash this reality through paying billions of dollars through the different actions it's taking: festival, sports, academic, diplomatic. Today, we hear about the great sports deals which Saudi Arabia is going through, and the great festivals in which it's hosting all the VIPs and famous people around the world. But they do not hear about the stories of the minors who are threatened by death penalty, nor about the stories of the women in the late years who are also victims of torture unprecedentedly, neither the stories of the young men who are being arrested and subject to torture, which is leading into many times a lot of physical and psychological traumas, which are very difficult to get rid of or be treated from. And also, no one is hearing about the different kind of violations against the foreign workers in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia is trying to hide the stories, those at the prisons, and sanction and fights anyone who's trying to raise the voice for that. Saudi Arabia is practicing torture widely, and instead of combating it as law subjects and as its commitments, its international commitments, especially the Convention Against Torture, it is fighting those who are speaking about that. So Jade Bassiouni from Reprieve was supposed to be with us. However, she couldn't make it for urgent reasons. But Mr. Zaki Saraf, who is the researcher at Reprieve, we're going to start with you. We know that since years that Reprieve is working on combating the death penalty around the world. Among these states is Saudi Arabia. The death penalty is no going back kind of sanction, and the states which are still carrying it on, they should commit to certain rules, to certain terms, to not having an unjust kind of a penalty. And during the last years of working with Reprieve, and especially those threatened to death in Saudi Arabia, we would like to know the status of the torture and its relationship to such kind of sanction. Zaki, you have the platform.
Many thanks, Dua and ESHR, for inviting me to speak this evening. So I'll speak about the death penalty and torture in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia have ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, which establishes that torture is absolutely prohibited with no exceptions. And yet, through our casework, it is clear that torture is systemic. Prisoners are routinely tortured into confession as they are interrogated, and those torture-tainted confessions are then relied upon to sentence individuals to death. Even the UN Committee Against Torture expressed its concern that, quote, torture and other ill treatment are commonly practiced in prisons and detention centers. Saudi Arabia's criminal justice system is inhumane and disregards international law obligations. Though in my intervention, I want to focus on the torture victims, the voices of the voiceless that have been brutalized by the Saudi regime. Firstly, starting with Hussein Abu Khair. Hussein was a Jordanian national. He was a driver with 8 children. He was arrested in 2014 when he was crossing the border into Saudi Arabia for alleged drug smuggling. Hussein denied the charges and so was subsequently brutally tortured for 12 days until he signed the confession. Prison officers hung him from his feet and beat his stomach, feet, and head. From the torture endured, Hussein developed chronic pain in his legs, stomach, and became nearly blind. He was never provided with legal representations, and so in his trial, he personally stressed that he was tortured into confessing, but the judges disregarded his comments. And no adequate investigations into his torture was ever conducted. His torture-tainted confession was relied upon by the judges, and he was executed earlier this year on the 12th of March, 2023. Secondly, on the case of Mustafa Darwish. Mustafa was arrested in 2015 for non-lethal protest-related offenses. Many, if not all, of the alleged offenses took place when he was a child. On arrest, Mustafa was placed in solitary confinement and severely tortured. He was beaten so badly that he lost consciousness several times. And his own words, he stated, quote, "The confession was extracted by the interrogator following physical and psychological torture. The interrogator who laughed at me and subjected me to sleep deprivation and beat me with sticks and electric wires." Mustafa's torture-tainted confession, similar to Hussein's, was relied upon by the judges, and he was executed on the 15th of June, 2021. Thirdly, on the case of Abdullah Al-Darazi, a child defendant who is currently at risk of execution for alleged non-lethal protest-related offenses. Abdullah was arrested by security officers in 2014 when he was 18 years old. Officers grabbed him when he was walking on the street and proceeded to beat him and arrest him without presenting an arrest warrant. Abdullah was held incommunicado for 3 months and remained in solitary confinement for approximately 6 months, during which time he was physically and psychologically tortured. Prison officers burned Abdullah around his eye, broke his tooth, and injured his knee. He was restrained and suspended for a long time, and his ear was severely injured as a result of the torture during this time. The guards beat Abdullah so aggressively, he was in a coma for 2 weeks. And in August 2017, following 3 years of pre-trial detention, Abdullah's trial began in the notorious Specialized Criminal Court. And during the trial, Abdullah detailed how he was tortured and coerced into signing a false confession. Abdullah told the judge, quote, "An investigating officer came to me with a written confession ready in his handwriting and asked me under beatings and threats to put a fingerprint on it without allowing me to read it." During the trial, Abdullah made numerous requests for his medical records to be admitted, showing his hospitalization from the torture endured to coerce his confession. But these requests were ignored by the court. Abdullah's torture-tainted confession was relied upon to sentence him to death, and currently his case is with the Supreme Court. And if they uphold the sentence, he could be executed at any time without notice. Saudi Arabia acts with impunity, with an absolute disregard for international law. Hussein, Mustafa, and Abdullah are only 3 examples of thousands of detainees that have been brutalized by the Saudi regime. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman tries to whitewash the extreme human rights violations of the kingdom with sporting events and empty promises of reform. Reality tells us a different picture. Reality paints a picture of bloodshed and lies, where torture and executions of torture victims is commonplace. Saudi Arabia's hosting of golfing events or purchasing football stars to the Saudi League should not distract and whitewash from the reality. Torture is systemic, and we should never forget the victims that have sadly lost their lives unjustly at the hands of the Saudi regime, and the many torture victims languishing in detention now with uncertain fates. That concludes my intervention. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zaki. I would like to add that according to our organization, there are 64 persons now at risk of death penalty, according to our numbers, and also according to our documentation. Most of these cases, all of the prisoners were subject to torture and mistreatment. And thank you, Zaki, for this intervention. Right now, we will be with our friend from MENA, researcher Falah Al-Sayed. Falah, what are the commitments according to the Convention Against Torture? As we said that Saudi Arabia has ratified it since 26 years ago, what are these commitments? And since it was documented that Saudi Arabia has used torture through complaints at the international platforms and through also United Nations reports, what are the commitments of the other states towards Saudi Arabia? Please, you have the platform, Falah.
Thank you so much, Dua, and everyone who's here listening to this webinar. Yeah, I mean, as Zaki was saying, you know, over the past few years, torture has actually been practiced, you know, systematically in Saudi Arabia to silence human rights defenders, lawyers, academics, anyone who actually expresses criticism towards the authorities. What's interesting, kind of, and as you said, Dua, the Saudi Arabia is actually a state party to the Convention Against Torture, and that is since 1997. So it is basically bound by any provision that's found in this convention. And despite that, Saudi Arabia, the Committee Against Torture, which is the organ that oversees the correct application of the convention. So that committee actually has already expressed concerns about the persistent practice of torture and any other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment in the country. And even so, it considered also that the corporal punishments that is provided within the Saudi law constitute torture in itself. And what's interesting to see is that the Saudi Criminal Procedure Code, or Procedural Criminal Code, is in force since 2013, prohibits subjecting an arrested person to torture or degrading treatment. However, the legislation does not contain a definition of the crime of torture, which is actually required by Article 2 of the Convention Against Torture. And there's also no clear legislative provision in the basic law of Saudi Arabia that guarantees the absolute and non-derogable prohibition of torture. Even worse, there's not even a specific provision declaring confessions. And as you said, Zaki, there's no specific provision declares confessions obtained under torture to be inadmissible in Saudi Arabia. And in its last concluding observations, the Committee Against Torture even noted with concern that confessions obtained under duress are admissible evidence in court in Saudi Arabia. MENA Rights Group, has documented several instances of torture while in detention. I'm not going to go over all of the cases because that would take, I don't want to say hours, but even days to go over. But what is important to keep in mind is that torture is often used to coerce such false confession, and it's then presented in court as evidence for the conviction of individuals. And as Zeki was explaining, there's a recent case of these multiple young adults that are facing execution, and all of the defendants were convicted for demonstrating against the states as minor and were tortured as detainees to coerce a false confession. And these confessions were actually later used as the sole evidence to sentence them to death. Unfortunately, and despite, several reports published by civil society organizations such as, Human Rights Watch or Al-Quds or any other organization, we still see that the international response and reaction does not really follow the reality on the ground. And this is particularly seen in cases of refoulement towards Saudi Arabia. And just for context, in international law, there is a principle that's called the principle of non-refoulement, and it basically precludes all countries in the world to send back a person where they may risk death or torture, and it's a norm of customary international law. So it is binding on all countries in the world, regardless of whether they are party of the convention. But in the context of Saudi Arabia, we know that human rights defenders are particularly at risk of torture. And despite all of these findings, countries continue to send back individuals to Saudi Arabia, claiming that Saudi Arabia is a reformed country that is building towards democracy, and that actually there's no humanitarian grounds that would even justify giving them asylum or temporary protection. Recently, actually, there was this case of a Saudi dissident who has fled to Bulgaria. And in 2021, he applied for asylum, but his request was actually denied by the Bulgarian Refugee Agency, claiming that official authorities in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have taken measures to democratize society, and considered, that the personal motives he referred to cannot be evaluated as humanitarian. And there's, a lot of similar cases. I can cite another one, which his outcome was actually quite tragic. It's a Saudi national from the Shia minority whose family has faced a long history of persecution, with several of his relatives who were executed or on death row. So he feared persecution himself, and he left Saudi Arabia in 2022. And unfortunately, on January 2023, he was arrested in Morocco at the airport on the basis of an arrest warrant that was circulated by the Arab Interior Ministers Council, which is basically the Arab Interpol. And the document refers to like an arrest warrant that was issued by Saudi Arabia's Public Prosecution Office, and that's based on the counterterrorism legal framework. And obviously his extradition would amount to, a violation of the principle of non-refoulement by Morocco, because he would risk torture when he would be sent back to Saudi Arabia. And despite that, the Cassation Court in Morocco rejected the request to release him and delivered an opinion agreeing to his extradition to Saudi Arabia. So unfortunately, he was extradited to Saudi Arabia. And similarly, another Saudi national was arrested in Morocco on the basis of a red notice by Interpol upon Saudi Arabia's request. And his case was also referred to the Court of Cassation, which, decided to rule in favor of the extradition. So he was also extradited. I don't know if I'm going a bit over time, but please feel free to cut me if I'm being too long. But just about the modus operandi maybe of the case of refoulement. So when someone is sent back to Saudi Arabia, and in the specific case of Saudi Arabia, should someone be forcibly returned there, it is likely that he would be arrested upon his arrival by members of the State Security Presidency, which oversees the mabahith on the basis of usually the counterterrorism legal framework. And then they would likely be transferred to an unknown location where they would remain forcibly disappeared outside the protection of the law for an extended period of time. And, usually these unknown locations are secret detention facilities where individuals are typically held incommunicado, tortured, denied their right to contact their family, and so on. And they're usually charged on the basis of the legal framework of counterterrorism, which enables different institutions such as the State Security Presidency, the Public Prosecution Office, or the Specialized Criminal Court to perpetrate gross human rights abuses. And usually they apply this counterterrorism legal framework when they sentence them. And when they apply it, they may also risk the death penalty. And we all know that Saudi Arabia has been, notorious in using the death penalty. Only last year, the largest mass execution of its history was carried out. And finally, just to end my long speech, I apologize. There are different mechanisms that can actually be used to combat the practice of torture on an international level. I'm not going to go over all of them because there might be a lot of them. So I'll go over the most specific ones. The Committee Against Torture is one of the most important ones, where there's, a regular state reporting. So the state has to, submit an initial report that will be reviewed by the committee, etc. One of the important mechanisms is actually communications and individual communications. So basically, individuals can submit complaints regarding violations of the convention by the state to the committee. And the communication that will be issued by the committee will be binding on the state parties. So this mechanism was used in the case of both the individuals that were arrested in Morocco and sent back. And unfortunately, despite the communication that was issued by the committee, they were extradited nevertheless. So basically, Morocco did not respect its obligations under the convention. And we can also submit, communications to the special rapporteurs. And that was done in the case of the Saudi individual that's currently detained in Bulgaria, who can also issue communications. And then there are some regional mechanisms that can be used, such as one very important one is the possibility to request interim measures from the European Court of Human Rights if a person is asking for protection in one of the countries of the Council of Europe. And these interim measures will be binding and will stop the refoulement. So it will stop the extradition or the sending back to Saudi Arabia. And it's actually very quick and effective. So that's a very good mechanism to use. And we also have domestic mechanisms, but I mean, this depends on each jurisdiction, such as universal. We can use universal jurisdiction in the case of someone who can be found in the country. We can use sanctions. We can use other mechanisms that are very domestic, but I'm also not going to go over all of them because there might be, we might not have time for it. So yeah, I'll just end my speech here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask away.
شكرا لك فلاح حقا.
Thank you so much, Falah, for all of this clarification and all of this information. And it's good to know that there are such mechanisms. It's good to know that there are possible means to raise the voice for such issues through specialists as you. And for truth knowing these mechanisms, actually suggest a question: how to get this information and how to access this information and how to reach the victims. All of these activists in Saudi Arabia, those in Saudi Arabia and offshore, are all the time looking for means to raise the voice for the violations cases, including the victims of torture, and they're trying to find means to support these victims and also to have a certain image to reflect what's going in reality in Saudi Arabia, despite the whitewashing that the state is trying to do. And after years of documenting the torture in Saudi Arabia, the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights, in conjunction with the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, launches a book training documenting torture in Saudi Arabia. This book is trying to highlight on how every citizen inside Saudi Arabia and outside Saudi Arabia can document these violations and how important are these documentations. Mr. Ta Al-Haji, who is a previous attorney in Saudi Arabia and also the legal director at the organization, will tell us more about this book and how to train on documentation for torture in Saudi Arabia. And before we hear his speech, we have a short video about this book.
شكرا لك دعاء، شكرا لكم جميعا على الحضور.
Thank you, Dua. Thank you, everyone, for attending and participating. Your valuable participation in this webinar. The European Saudi Organization for Human Rights have been working throughout the years in documenting hundreds of cases of torture in Saudi Arabia. And despite all of the challenges and difficulties we have faced, either from the repression inside or the difficulty of accessing this information and fearing the safety and the lives of those people who are helping us in accessing this information. And despite that, the organization has found means to document the torture which is happening and proving the false claims of the state. Saudi Arabia is repeating in the international platforms that it prohibits torture and that it abides to the Convention Against Torture. The importance of documenting torture is crucial to prove the false claims of Saudi Arabia through the names, the information, the data. I'm trying to talk slowly so as the translation would go smooth. So the second point, to have a counter speech to face the whitewashing which the state is trying to do, which focuses on the stories of the victims. And it wouldn't be just focusing on what the state claims. And also advocating the victims and supporting them throughout the different means, through the complaints and through media. Also supporting the female and male activists inside and confirming that they have a voice which will reach the international platforms, and also collecting enough information and proof as means. And because all of this world is heading towards an international judicial law, so we can actually subject those people who participated in torturing to accountability, and also activate the mechanisms of the United Nations through the complaints programs. These are some of the benefits of documenting torture in Saudi Arabia. How to document, taking into consideration that Saudi Arabia is trying to close every possible mean through the victims or the victims' families. It's also tried to exploit the official Human Rights Committee, which we all know that it's trying to cover up for all of these violations, and it's not actually doing its role, especially with the absence of having civil society organizations or associations, and through its repression, now we can see that no one inside Saudi Arabia is being able to follow up such cases. So the European Saudi Organization on Human Rights tried to document all of the different cases in this book, in which this book shows how to document and collect data, the proof, through the legal documents of the courts, and how to meet these victims, the mechanisms of meeting them, interviewing them, especially that some of these victims have post-trauma. And also you can see all of these details, but they are very difficult to get, especially inside Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia not only physically tortures during solitary confinement, which can last for months. So even if the torture, some would have the torture impacts on their bodies disappear because of the long period of detainment, but other signs of torture will remain. And also how to communicate with the families of the victims, how to file the complaints, and within Saudi Arabia, finding new means in order to combat any human rights activism in Saudi Arabia. So this book is an attempt to have a security, digital security, in order to protect it and protect any thing which can threaten the safety and the freedom of the individuals who are working on documenting these violations. So this book is an attempt to collect all of these efforts and finding new ways to keep on documenting torture in Saudi Arabia. Today's world, we are trying to find new means to hold accountable all of these violators, all of these participating in torture, and not just having or being content with the internal legislation, because the attorney should know that most of the confessions are being taken under torture, and they should double check all of these claims and not to be biased to what the public prosecution would just provide. So we are preparing all of these files, and as you all know, there's difficulty in using the international litigation means, but the files would be ready when the time is appropriate, and we will provide them, and hopefully everyone who participated in torture would be prosecuted. And because we all know that the torture which is happening in a broadly within not being punished and is a crime against humanity, we consider that documenting this torture and the violation is of a great importance, because every citizen and every victim is worth defending, and torture and maltreatment in all levels is considered a crime. So this book helped not only the specialists, but the non-specialists, everyone who is interested in human rights activists, help them on how to document torture in a good and proper way. Thank you. Thank you, Taha. So the first question within to be posed on how to file the complaints. Some will ask, like, the medical reports or the interviews with the victims. Is this sufficient to document the torture, and is it enough as a material to be used in the advocacy or the legal accountability against those who participated in torture? Is that question for me? Yes. Because you are encouraging documentation, yes, it's considered an official document provided before the court and the judge. The judges, they have reviewed that, and it was stated in the provisions, and the judge neglecting such appeals are a proof in themselves. Even if they are just claims, the judge must seek to double check these claims. But what we see in Saudi Arabia, that the judge wouldn't give it any consideration, although it is a solid proof for very clear legal texts. What's happening in the Saudi prisons, that after taking the confessions forcibly, they are ratified while the prisoner is still in prison, and that's before a judge. And when this case is filed, the confessions would be provided before another judge. So this also a violation not only for the Saudi law, but also for the international law. So at least we can double confirm from these claims if the torture did happen or did not happen, and then we would actually have also approved that the jurisdiction has integrity in dealing with these cases or not. So now my question is to Zaki, since he's an expert in international advocacy. Zaki, what are the best advocacy international-wise with a state as Saudi Arabia? And according to your experience and your work, did the organizations in the previous years have actually rescued any person from death penalty, or from raising the voices for those tortured or victims of torture to international courts, or to a platform which those people in charge for that are held accountable?
Thank you, Dua, for the question. So I think just to start, I think it's very important, considering that Saudi Arabia's criminal justice system is so opaque and there is such a lack of transparency. Firstly, it's important to raise the profile of cases. I mean, so many individuals have been arrested, tried, sentenced, and executed in absolute secrecy. So I think the number one thing that should be stressed is that where possible, and I know that other panelists have mentioned, documentation. As much information as possible on specific cases, as much information on the circumstances of their arrest, and then taking that and encouraging the international community to apply as much pressure to Saudi Arabia as possible. There are so many of these cases in which the due process violations are extreme. I mean, from Hassan Abu Khair's case, as I had mentioned in my intervention, of him being tortured for 12 days into confessing and never been given legal representation. I think these are very key due process rights that everyone should be afforded. And in Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, it's not something which is a guarantee for detainees. So encouraging states, ensuring states apply pressure and don't allow Saudi Arabia to act with impunity. And we've seen the opposite. We've seen where states allow Saudi Arabia to act with impunity. For example, in the mass execution last year, March last year, 81 men were executed in Saudi Arabia, where the majority were executed, were tried and sentenced in secrecy. The then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Saudi Arabia a few days after, and he didn't condemn the executions or the flagrant human rights violations of the state, but rather he posed for photo ops, and he was trying to strike oil deals and having photo shoots with Mohammed bin Salman. That leads to further impunity, because what that shows Saudi Arabia is that they can carry on doing what they please, and there will not be any backlash from the international community and from key partners such as the UK. And of course, it's something in which there are cases which we've been successful, and of course, Reprieve's work, we've always partnered and worked with ESOHR and with Dua and Taha and everyone in the team. And there are cases which I want to highlight which show the effect of international advocacy, and the cases of Ali Nimr, Dawood al-Marhoon, and Abdullah al-Zahir. So these were 3 child defendants who were arrested in 2012 for alleged protest-related offenses, all under the age of 18. So they were tortured into confessing, and they were held incommunicado during their detention. And so there was a real concerted effort by the international community, by key actors, that highlighted the fact that these are child defendants, torture victims, and it is completely indefensible for them to be detained, of course, but also for them to be on death row. And so, of course, using mechanisms such as the UN Working Group and arbitrary detention, going to the UN Special Rapporteurs, going to different states and applying pressure to ensure that Saudi Arabia cannot execute individuals in secrecy is the key. Because in a perfect world, Saudi Arabia will not execute anyone. But where they do execute, they execute in absolute secrecy. They don't, Mohammed bin Salman wouldn't want the negative image of executions taking place, no less for torture victims and child defendants. And so it's important to amplify cases to ensure that the world knows about the cases, to ensure that the Saudi authorities understand that they cannot get away with executing individuals in secrecy and not having anyone speak about it. So this is why I think it's very important on a day like today, where to name the victims, to amplify cases, to understand the circumstances that the prisoners that have unfortunately been executed, but also the detainees that are currently facing execution, that are currently at risk of execution after being tortured into confessing.
شكرا لك زكي. صحيح يعني أن نذكر الأسماء.
Thank you, Zaki. It's very important to mention their names, to not leave their story, to not just have the victims just as numbers. This is a prime objective for human rights activism, and also to defend the other detainees in similar situations. Here, I would like to ask Falah, according to your experience and all of the details you have said in your valuable intervention and international litigation, we saw a glimpse of hope as holding accountable those who participated in torture, especially in the European countries. Is there any horizon for holding accountable those who participated in torture before the European courts? Or this is not possible? Because we saw that some are being held accountable in Germany and France. Can this be applied to Saudi Arabia? Are there any possible means to do that in the file of Saudi Arabia?
I mean, obviously the tool, so I very briefly touched upon it when I was speaking in my intervention, but the tool of universal jurisdiction is obviously a very interesting one. And for those who don't necessarily know what it is, it's actually a tool that allows any country in the world to pursue any person in the world who has committed a grave crime anywhere in the world against anyone in the world. So it's a very large tool. However, it's still a domestic tool. So each country decides how they want to limit or not limit their universal jurisdiction. Usually, since it's a very large concept, a universal jurisdiction is limited by the presence of the person within the territory of the country. So, for instance, if a Saudi official who might have committed acts of torture travels to, I don't know, France, Switzerland, Belgium, any European country or non-European country, actually, because many other countries also provide for universal jurisdiction. You can just, inform your local NGO, your local authorities, and they might be able to take action against that person because torture is usually inscribed as a grave crime in the legislations of. I mean, it should be inscribed as a grave crime in all the legislations of the countries that are party to this to the Convention Against Torture. So yeah, I mean, I think there is some ways to hold accountable some perpetrators of these crimes, but I wouldn't be too optimistic. There is this tool. However, there is also some political considerations that are usually taken by many countries. So as Zeki said, advocacy and litigation should go hand in hand. You do some advocacy from one side, but litigation will only work if advocacy also goes hand in hand with it. So that's what I would say.
صحيح ولكن
This is true, but I think according to what you have said, we can confirm the importance of documenting the tortures on the long run so that we can have actual material, a lot of data, interviews, stories of victims, and to encourage the victims who go offshore, the torture victims or their relatives, to always speak about and raise the voice, because this can be an introduction to use these means. As Mr. Taha has said, they are developing day by day to hold accountable all of these perpetrators. For example, there are judges in Saudi Arabia who were in charge for issuing judgments, death penalties against minors who were also executed, or some at risk of execution. Those judges are detained in Saudi Arabia for treason or not, probably. Mr. Taha, can we consider that such steps or these changes which are happening an encouraging factor for the resident citizens to speak about these violations and use this training which our organization issued as a means to document the torture and speak about the tortures? Can we consider this encouraging for the victims, or on the long run, and to not have, or to have actual newer steps which can underestimate the importance of documenting such torture for individuals? Of course, they are very important steps, we have mentioned years ago, we don't think that a case would be filed before for an official or an officer in Germany, but we found that Saudi Arabia has filed cases for officers who were perpetrators. So the situation has changed. So now whoever is going to practice any torture, he will think again before doing that, because they might be held accountable. So the legal procedures in Saudi Arabia need a certain capacity, and to have the perpetrator and victim are present. So documenting these cases is very important. So probably one of the parties is in one of the European states, but if you don't have a complete file documented to be provided, so we can't do anything. So it's not enough just to do social media speeches. It's important to have proofs that this is a perpetrator, a person who has participated in torture. So documenting this practice is very important. The legal obstacles are present, definitely. We're not very optimistic, but we always think that things might change to the better, even if there isn't any legal prosecution or accountability. But we can use these files before the United Nations mechanisms to unveil what's really going on in the presence of Saudi Arabia and raise voice before the world to uncover what's really going on in Saudi Arabia, despite what the Saudi Arabia media is promoting. This is true. What about that the Saudi government is criminalizing communicating with human rights organizations or outside Saudi Arabia, or communicating with the media means? So how can we encourage the citizens inside Saudi Arabia to communicate with us or any other association within all of these violations? So I know there is a part in this book which highlights the protection, the digital protection, the digital security, especially that Saudi Arabia uses very developed tools to monitor the cell phones, to monitor all the activists or anyone who tries to communicate with activists outside Saudi Arabia or with NGOs. There is a chapter in this book which mentions this on digital security and protection, but I think we are encouraging individuals to document the torture, speak about the violations, and confirm that individual security is a priority and that there are outcomes for this action. First of all, from using this documentation and using it in advocacy, as Zaki has mentioned, or using it later on in litigation. So what other message we can send to those citizens? And how can the human rights organizations help the citizens inside who are subject to such legal prosecution in case they documented? Can they give them any guidelines, any specific advices in this aspect? I think the first step is to, first of all, use all the means possible in Saudi Arabia. First of all, filing complaints inside Saudi Arabia is a very important step, although the outcomes of it are not guaranteed. And also to file a complaint before the Committee of Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, although we know that this committee doesn't really act upon its role as it's supposed to, but I confirm actually that this is a means of documentation in which then they would be held accountable. And to defend the families of the victims, the activists. They should use all the means inside, whether before the courts, filing complaints to the Royal Diwan, or this is an attempt to speak about these violations and end them. These are a way of documentation we can use in later phases or stages, either before the Saudi jurisdiction or the United Nations mechanisms, or in later stages for legal prosecution. This is one of the means. The other means, those who are inside Saudi Arabia can use correspondence in a safe, secure way with human rights organizations, or use directly the mechanisms of United Nations, and there are a lot of secure ways to do that. Probably this is one of the means which they can raise the voice to deliver such message. Also, the possible means to communicate with the activists inside, I think these are means that can be used to end such violations and complaints. I also recall that this book training on documenting torture has a brief on how to use the international mechanisms for individuals and not just for organizations, filing complaints individual-wise, communicating with the United Nations, also considering interviewing the victims. The book confirms the importance, because the objective is supporting the victims. So there are specific means to do these interviews. There are specialists who know how to do it. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, sometimes a non-specialist citizen, it's required that he or she does this documentation and take the information from the victim. It could be one of the family members, activists, or any citizen who would like to help those victims. So this book has a special part on how to conduct interviews with these victims and how to use these interviews by any citizen. So thank you, all of you. Thank you, Falah. Thank you, Zaki. Thank you, Mr. Ta, for participation, for this valuable information. I believe that this webinar and other webinars and events which activists and human rights defenders and organizations and any words spoken on behalf of the violations of against victims of torture, death penalty victims, are a voice to be raised against the attempt of Saudi Arabia to silence them. So let's, all of us, according to what we have, to what means we have, to be a voice for these victims and to truly support them against the attempts of silencing and neglecting their stories. And we hope that torture would be a past thing to be speaking about. Thank you, everyone.
شكراً.